Hi everyone, my name is Alex Markin and I am from the Rhode Island Intensive Math Intervention Project. Thank you so much for joining me today. Today, we are going to discuss how to administer screening and progress monitoring assessments virtually using assessments that are available online and those that are paper pencil. The content from this training was informed from a variety of resources that you can find at the end of this presentation. Today, we are going to learn about potential barriers and solutions to administering screening and progress monitoring assessments virtually. We will also look at some resources that you can share with families so they can better understand their roles, responsibilities, and how to best support their student. Lastly, we will include links to additional resources on administering assessments virtually that may be helpful. We would like to recognize the National Center on Intensive Intervention for providing much of the content covered today. To start, let's review different data sources that you likely collect in your classroom. Screening or benchmarking assessments are administered several times per year, usually in the fall, winter, and spring, to all students, and results are used to identify what students know and where they need support. Once students who need additional support are identified, teachers use progress monitoring assessments to measure growth over time and determine when an instructional change is needed. Diagnostic data is used to help teachers identify students' specific skill deficits so they can make targeted, individualized, and data-driven changes to students' intervention plans. Lastly, fidelity data helps educators determine if an intervention has been implemented as intended, and if so, determine which elements can be adjusted to intensify the intervention and meet students' needs. This quick resource serves as a reminder of the importance of fidelity when administering screening or progress monitoring assessments. We want to make sure that the data we are collecting are as valid as they can be. This is especially important to consider when we are administering assessments virtually using processes that they may not be validated by the assessment publisher. That doesn't mean that you should not administer these assessments, but instead we should acknowledge potential limitations and consider how we can use additional data sources so that we can be more confident in the results, described later in this presentation. These are important considerations for educators to be aware of when administering screening or progress monitoring assessments virtually. While screening or progress monitoring data identifies students at risk or in need of interventions, results should also be used more broadly to identify issues related to core instruction. Not doing so can lead to over-identification of students for intervention or removing students from core instruction in order to participate in intervention, both of which are problematic in terms of staff time and capacity. With progress monitoring, there are challenges with selecting reliable tools and concerns about administering these assessments virtually when they are validated for face-to-face administration. Publishers are releasing information about how to adapt these tools in a way to increase the validity and reliability when administering virtually, so make sure to check out their websites. With diagnostic data, we usually do a good job of collecting data, but not necessarily using it to adjust instruction. Finally, fidelity data can be challenging to collect. In times of COVID-19, collecting attendance data in particular can be challenging, as it is very difficult to determine if asynchronous learning opportunities are being completed. This infographic details fidelity considerations for educators as they implement interventions. It includes several elements that people do not often think of when monitoring fidelity, such as student engagement and quality of delivery. It is important to emphasize that fidelity goes beyond following a script to also include elements like whether students actively participated during intervention sessions or participated to the full duration of each session. Each of these elements described may provide us with additional information to consider when determining students' progress. If we do not collect fidelity data, then we may not be able to make informed decisions on whether or not the implementation of the intervention is contributing to students' non-responsiveness. Because intervention delivery is likely adapted due to COVID, our fidelity monitoring will also need to adapt. Your best bet is to identify the core components of the intervention that can easily be implemented within your context. For example, if your implementation typically requires 2 30-minute sessions per week, but because of your schedule, you can only deliver 10-minute sessions 5 days per week virtually, your fidelity monitoring plan should reflect the new schedule. Another example might be related to the actual delivery of the intervention. You may consider pre-recording the scripted part of the lesson, allowing students to watch it, and then focusing your virtual session with a student on modeling the particular skill. Your Fidelity monitoring plan would need to reflect this change as well. For more in-depth information about Fidelity, check out our other learning module titled Features of Fidelity on our project's website. Now we're going to dive more deeply into considerations for administering screening assessments virtually. First, let's start with a quick reminder about why screening assessments are useful. These data allow us to identify which standard a student has mastered, standards where students need additional support, and how to monitor student growth over time since it is administered several times during the school year. When administering screening assessments this fall, do not be surprised if there's a larger percentage of students than normal who are performing below grade level. After all, students may have had inconsistent access to instruction since March. While you may see an increase in the number of students performing below benchmark, don't rush to intervene through targeted or intensive interventions. Rather, consider looking at your data to determine patterns in performance for all learners and ways to address those patterns during core instruction. For example, using a strategy like number talks at the start or end of instruction can help you focus on providing practice opportunities to build students' fluency more efficiently than reteaching a concept. Leverage your students. If you'd like more information about number talks, check out our learning module available on our website. Here we present considerations for teachers to reflect on when administering screening assessments virtually. Plan for your role during this time. For instance, will you have a role in monitoring students while they take the assessment? And if so, which platform will you use? Will you need to schedule a time for students to take the assessment? If students do not have access to the necessary technology at home, teachers may be able to administer the assessment to students at school. Work with students' parents or guardian to identify a time for their child to come to the school in order to complete the assessment. You may want to create a sign-up sheet and send reminders so parents know when to bring their child to the building. This can also help ensure that there's a computer or other necessary materials available when the student arrives. If students will be completing the assessment virtually, provide guidance so that their parents or guardians know how to support them. For example, parents will need to know their child's login information, how long the assessment will last, and what prompting is okay to provide, such as time cues or reminders to slow down, and what is not okay, like helping their child solve the problems or providing a calculator. We've created a one-pager for parents that is previewed on the next slide and available in the Module Resources folder. Earlier in this presentation, we briefly described the importance of maintaining a consistent learning environment in order to improve the validity of the assessment. This means that students should complete the assessment in the same environment over time. If students take the assessment virtually in the fall, they should also do so in the winter and spring, even if they return to school for in-person instruction. Here's a quick one-pager that can be shared with parents in advance of administering the screening assessment virtually. It describes the purpose of the assessment, what parents should do, what their child needs to do, and some prompts that are okay for parents to use with their child. Feel free to share this resource broadly. Now we're going to dive more deeply into considerations for administering progress monitoring assessments virtually. First, we want to set the stage. Teachers collect a lot of data in order to understand how their students are performing. Not all data collected can be considered formal progress monitoring, but that doesn't mean they aren't useful. Ongoing formative assessment techniques like questioning or exit tickets can provide teachers with just-in-time information for adjusting instruction. Formal progress monitoring uses a valid and reliable tool, and that is administered in a standardized way, serves a different purpose. Formal progress monitoring assessments are useful. They are about a lot more than complying with data collection procedures. Progress monitoring data allow us to determine students' growth over time and in relationship to a goal, in order to determine if they are making adequate progress. If students are not making adequate progress, it can help us determine when an instructional change or intensification is needed. Another purpose of progress monitoring is to compare different interventions to determine which is working best for our students. Generally, progress monitoring data are collected for students receiving intervention to inform us about when to make an adaptation to the intervention. Analyzing how a student performs on a formal progress monitoring assessment especially if there are patterns that we are noticing that are similar to what we observe on informal assessments, can inform the type of adaptation that is needed. These are broad questions that educators should consider prior to administering screening or progress monitoring assessments remotely. Number 1, will the data be valid? Will these data be an accurate representation of student performance? We do not want to be collecting data for the sake of collecting data. We want to make sure that the data we are using are valid and can be used to drive instruction. Number 2, will it be feasible? Is it going to be possible to collect data in this context? For example, if a student does not have access to technology, it will not be feasible to administer a virtual assessment remotely. Instead, try to identify a reasonable replacement, such as having the student come into the building in order to complete the assessment. And number 3, is this information we are going to be receiving helpful? Again, we want to make sure that the data we are collecting are actionable and can be used to improve communication with parents or improve the delivery of instruction. This is a quick tip sheet that you can share with your colleagues that details some considerations for administering progress monitoring assessments virtually. The URL to this resource is on the bottom of this slide, and it's also available in the Module Resources folder. Some progress monitoring tools that you may want to administer may be only beneficial for analyzing student errors when completed by paper pencil. For example, in mathematics, it's more important for us to look at students' work to isolate if an incorrect answer is due to a fluency-related issue or a misunderstanding of place value. Before you administer these assessments, stop and consider the feasibility of administering given the current context. Just because you have used this assessment in the past does not mean it's appropriate for remote instruction. However, if you would like to move forward with administering the assessment, consider the following. Number 1, make sure you prepare all of the materials that the student will need ahead of time and determine the best way to provide these materials in advance to the student's parents. This may be done through a pick-up and drop-off process, email, or snail mail. Number 2, communicate the procedures to students' parents. For example, if the assessment is timed, make sure the parent uses a stopwatch or timer to ensure the student is working for the appropriate amount of time. Number 3, determine your role in monitoring the assessment. For example, do you want to watch or listen to the student complete the assessment using video conferencing or by calling the student at home? And number 4, determine how you are going to receive the results. You may want to have the student's parents record the administration or take a picture of the assessment and then text or email you the recording and picture so that you can begin to score the assessment quickly and see where the student made mistakes. Alternatively, determine if the parent could drop off the assessment at the school or return the assessment to you via snail mail. It is a best practice to examine multiple data sources, and this is even more important when there are concerns about an assessment's reliability and validity. Be conscious of the number of assessments that students are taking. If you're not going to use the data to inform instruction, then consider why you are administering the assessment in the first place. Some additional data sources that you may want to look at include classroom assessments like entry and exit tickets or unit assessments, other progress monitoring measures, student work samples, discussions with the student and their family, and previous performance data. In combination, formal and informal assessments may paint a more comprehensive picture for our next steps in supporting students. As a quick summary, today we reviewed the different types of assessments that you are likely administering to students. We discussed considerations to take into account when creating a plan for administering assessments remotely, and we examined some resources that are available to share with your colleagues and students' parents or guardians. We hope that you enjoyed this module. Please complete the evaluation before you leave. These are my colleagues on the Rhode Island Math Intervention Project. We want to support you with providing high-quality instruction across settings, including in-person, hybrid, and virtual. So let us know how we can support you. Lastly, this learning module was informed by a variety of articles and websites, all of which are listed below.